Hashem, we get started with today's Daf Yomi, which is Menachos Daf Mem. Hey, Menachos 45, but we're going to start on the bottom of Mem Daled on the base 44b, where we have the Mishnah Haparim V'Ha'elim V'Ha'Kevasim. If you have bulls, rams, and sheep, and we'll see from our Gemara that this is part of the communal Karbanos Musaf, Einan Ma'akvin Zed they they do not prevent the other one, meaning to say, if you only have some of them, you bring those, even though you don't have all the animals. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Im hayu lahem parim merubim, so a separate law. Rabbi Shimon says, let's say you have money to purchase a lot of bowls, v'lo yohem nesachim, but then they wouldn't have the nesachim, which are the accompanying offerings, the mincha and the wine that accompany the communal offering. Yavi par echad, then you should bring one bowl unisachav with its libation. Don't bring all of them without any libations. So first the Gemara says, what type of carbon are we talking about? Hani paramukvasim dehecha. Which bulls and sheep are we talking about? So there are three major places in the Torah where we discuss the karbanos, in Emor, in Pinchas, and in Re'eh. So the karbanos of the festivals. So if you want to say it's the bulls and the sheep of Sukkot, it can't be. Kamishpatam ksibhu. It says about the bulls of Sukkot that it needs to be done exactly. Kamishpatam. They're all ma'ak. Ela de Rosh Chodesh v'atzeres techumash apikudim. Maybe it's referring to the karban musaf of Rosh Chodesh and Shvuos that's mentioned in Parshas Pinchas and Bamidbar. It can't be. Why? Elim dehecha. Where are the rams that it's referring to? Idahanu. If we're talking about the rams if we want to say that we're talking about, the ram that is mentioned in Bamidbar with respect to Shavuos and Rosh Chodesh, it can't be. Why? Why can it not be that? Because the Mishnah says Haparim va'elim and the rams, and in about Shavuos and Rosh Chodesh it says Ayil Achad Idahanu the Ayilhu. If it's the case, if it's referring to Bamidbar, it just mentions one ayil, the Ida Tzeres the Torah Kohanim. And if you want to say, well, it's referring to the Shavuos that's mentioned in Emor, that can't be, because there we know it is Me'akev. Why? Because there it says Havaya Ksivu. It says the words Yiyu, which means that is a requirement. So it can't be the two rams that are mentioned in Emor about Shavuos. So therefore, the Gemara says the Olam that Tzeres to Torah's Kohanim. No, it is referring to the two rams that are brought on Shavuos that are mentioned in Emor, and V'Hachakamar Lo Elam the Torah's Kohanim Ma'akvilei LaAyol the Chumash Apikudim LaAyol the Chumash Apikudim Ma'akvilu LaElam the Torah's Kohanim. Meaning to say that the rams that are, this is what our Mishnah is saying, the rams that are brought with the Shtei Alechem on Shavuos with the two loaves of bread, they do not prevent, if they're not brought, they don't prevent the ram that's brought with the Musaf on Shavuos, and vice versa as well. That those two separate karbanos, which are mentioned in Emor and Pinchas, do not prevent the other one from being brought. So the Gemara says, Ella, well, if that's the case, parim da'afilu ha'adadi lo ma'akvi. So you mean to say that the rams? So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, we have a different question. What does our Mishnah mean when it says the cows that afilu ha'adadi lo ma'akvi? They're not even ma'akiv each other within the same korban, within the same parasha. Whereas the elim, the hacha v'hacha hudu lo ma'akvi, but the rams are not ma'akev from the ones in Emor to the one in Pinchas. That's not ma'akev, but the elam the hacha v'hacha udu ma'akev, but inu ma'akev. But in the same two rams of Shavuos, they are ma'akev each other. So it doesn't make sense, because our Mishnah is saying the param on their own are not ma'akev. ma'akev, but the rams on their own are ma'akev. So if that's the case, how could the Mishnah include them in the same law? So the Gemara says, Tana mili mili katani. It's two separate laws, but the Mishnah wrote them all together. Now the Gemara is going to go through a series of, going to explain specific psukim in Ezekiel and the prophecy of Yechezkel, which are apparently contradictory at first glance to the words of the Torah. And the Gemara is going to show how we can explain this prophecy of Ezekiel. It says in Ezekiel, B'yom HaChodesh, on the Rosh Chodesh, Par ben Bakar, you should bring a bull, tamim, shisha kvasim, and 6 sheep, v'ayel tamimim, and 1 ram, v'ayel tamimim, So this is a reference to the karbanos of Rosh Chodesh. So the Gemara says, well, Fishin Emar b'Torah Parim. It says in the Torah, in the passage of Rosh Chodesh, Parim b'nei bakar shnayim, and minayim shalomin. So the Gemara wants to say, first of all, the Gemara says, I skipped a line. Gemara says, Par ma'atam. Why does Ezekiel say 1 bull, where in Rosh Chodesh we're told that you're supposed to bring 2 bulls? So it's to tell us, Lafisha Nemar b'Torah, because it says in the Torah, Parim, 2 bulls. Uminayim shem lo matzah shnayim. How do we know if you didn't find 2 bulls? How do we know that if you don't find 2 bulls, maybe echad, you can even bring 1? Tamomer par. It says bull. And why does it mean when Ezekiel says on Rosh Chodesh you should bring shisha kvasim, 6 sheep, whereas in the Torah it says you're supposed to bring 7 sheep for the Musaf Rosh Chodesh? Matam Omar. Fisha kasa b'Torah shiva. The Torah says 7. Minayin shemul matzah shiva yavi shisha. I don't know if you didn't find 7, you could even bring 6. Tam Omar shisha. It says 6. Minayin shemul matzah shisha yavi chamisha. Chamisha yavi arba yavi shlosha yavi shnayim afilu echad. I don't know if you didn't find any of these, you could bring even 1. Tam Omar because it says in Ezekiel, the sheep, whatever you can find, which means even if you only find 1 sheep, you could bring it as the musaf. So since it says whatever you find, you could bring shisha kvasim normally. So why did it say 6? If you find 1, that's also okay. Mar says the kama da efshar hadure madrinan, because you're supposed to look for more. You can't just say, well, I have 1 and that's enough. You have to look for as many as you can find. And how do we know that this kvasim, if you have all 7, Rashi says, if you have the 2 bulls, or if you have the 7 sheep, that you're then under those circumstances, you can't bring 1 without the other. If you don't have them, you can bring 1 without the other. But if you have them, how do we know that they are ma'akev? Tamalomer yiyu. Then it says the verse yiyu. We're in the middle of 48a. And so now once the Gemara has raised the apparent contradiction between Ezekiel and the Torah, and it shows how it's not a contradiction, the Gemara cites several other examples where Ezekiel is apparently contradicting the Torah. It says, Ko amar Hashem Elokim, b'rishon ba'echad l'chodesh, on the first month, on the first day of the month, tikach par ben bakar tamim, v'ch piteisa es hamikdash. You shall take a bull, and you will purify the temple. But this is a problem because the bull of Rosh Chodesh is an olah, not a chatas. So why does Ezekiel call the bull a chatas? That's what the Gemara asks. Chatas, olah. It's not a chatas, it's an olah. So it says Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan, Parsha zu Elyo Asir L'Dorsha. So this is a very much discussed drasha, a statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, we can't answer this question. Eliyahu is going to come and darshan it. First of all, the minute after he says that, Rav Ashi gives an answer. So that's saying, what are you talking about? Why are you relying on Elijah? We can do it. But the other explanation is, well, Elijah, if he's resurrecting the dead, the other question is, well, then you could just ask Yechezkel what he meant, because he resurrected Yechezkel. So that's why he's saying that this is the proof that Eliyahu is going to come prior to the resurrection of the dead, because that the day that Eliyahu comes is prior to the resurrection of the dead. Anyway, Rabbi Yochanan says this passage we can't explain it. Eliyahu is going to explain it. Rav Ashi says No, Rav Ashi gives a different answer. He says, "Milua mikrivu b'mei Ezra kiderach sheikrivu b'mei Moshe." When Ezekiel was prophesying about the second base of Mikdash, when Ezra came back and rebuilt the temple in that generation, that they brought the inaugural offerings just like Moshe did, and just like uh, on the eighth day of the Miluim, which was Rosh Chodesh Nisan. There on that day, they brought a calf for a chatas. Here too, they also brought a bull on Rosh Chodesh as a chatas. So that's the answer that Rabbi Ashi gives. Tanya Nami Hachi, we have a brisa that reflects this debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Ashi. Rabbi Ashi is much later than Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is the first generation of Amoraim. Rabbi Ashi is the last. So for several generations, they were waiting for Eliyahu until Rav Ashi said, "I'm not waiting anymore." And we have a brisa that they found that reflects this. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Parsha Zu Eliyahu Atid L'Darsha Amrlo Rabbi Yossi Milu Mikrivu B'Mei Ezra Kederach Shekrivu B'Mei Moshe. And then when he said this, Amarlo, when Rabbi Yossi said this to Rabbi Yehuda said, Tanuach Datcha Shenachta Data. He says, you should be calm because you calmed me down, you appease me. Another apparent contradiction between Ezekiel and the Torah. It says V'chol nevelo treifa. It says in Ezekiel all nevelos and treifos from the birds and from the animals the Kohanim cannot eat. It says the Gemara HaKohanim Hudu El Yochel, are the Kohanim the only ones who cannot eat this? That's the case, that the Kohanim can't eat it. Yisrael Achli, but the Yisrael can eat nevela. Is a contradiction between Yechezkel and the words of the Torah. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Parasha Zu Eliyahu Atilu Darsha. This passage will be expounded in the future by Eliyahu. We can't understand it. Ravina is a contemporary of Rav Ashi. He says Rav Ashi is trying to answer the question that Eliyahu will, and I'll give my answer also. Ravina Amar Kohanim Itzrachle. Kohanim are the ones who it's needed to teach us this pasuk, meaning to say, we might have thought, we know that the Israelim can't eat it. We might have thought that the Kohanim would have been able to eat it. Salkadai the Chamina, whole of the history, Miliko Gabayo, since the Malika is allowed for the Kohanim when you do the Malika on a sin offering of a bird. That's where you kill it with your thumb. You're not killing it with Shlita, but that's allowed. Tishtri Nami Nevelu Trefa. Matter of fact, okay, also all Nevelus and Trefas are allowed. The Hutra, that once it's allowed, it's all allowed. So we say that Ezekiel is saying it's not allowed. Another apparent contradiction. B'Shiva b'Chodesh Meish Shogeh Umipesi v'chipartem esabayis. So you shall do on the seventh day of the month. Remember, man who made a mistake, and you will purify the temple. Well, what carbon is brought on the seventh day of the month? Shiva. What does it mean, the seventh day of the month? That doesn't make sense. So the Gemara says, "Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Elu Shiva Shvatim Shechatu." We're reminded now of the Gemara in Harios, Daf Gimel, takes us back to the beginning of Harios. This refers to the 7 tribes that sinned, that they bring the communal sin offering. If the court issues a mistaken ruling and the majority of the people follow it, then we have to bring the court has to bring a parallel davar shel tzibur. And here it's teaching us that the seven of the tribes, even though they're not the majority of the people, the majority of each tribe sin, then we have to bring a parallel davar shel tzibur. Even though they're not the majority of the community. Chodesh, what does it mean? Shiva b'chodesh. It doesn't mean the month, the 7th day of the month. It means im chadshu. If they came up with a new law, chidshu, they came up with a new law, and they said v'amru chelav mutar. They said something like chelav, which is a punishment of kares, and they said it was allowed. Meish shogel pasi. And then they said that if this chelav is permitted, and they said that under those circumstances, melamed she'ein chayavin el alam davar im shiglas ma'aser. It means to say, what does it mean shogeg upasi? That you're only liable for this communal offering if there will be a mistake in action. So in this now the Gemara says in this context, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Zachar also Ish Tov. This man is remembered for good. V'Chanina ben Chizkiah Shemo. His name is Chanina ben Chizkiah. Shel Moayu were not for him. Nigna Sefer Yechezkel. They would have buried the book of Yechezkel. Yechezkel Hanavi. The rabbis would have buried him. Would have buried the book and said it's not a holy book. Because they would have said Sha'idvar Sotrin Divrei Torah, because its words contradicted the Torah. So what did he do? Hela Shalosh Meos. What did he do? He brought up 300 garbei shem and barrels of wine. V'yashav ba'aliyah, and he sat in the upper chamber of Udarasha. We expounded it all night. One of the questions that I have is, if Chanina ben Chizkiah expounded all the drashas, then how come Ravina and how come Rabbi Yochanan tell we have to wait for Eliyahu? Or how come Ravina and Rav Ashi came up with their own answers? Didn't he solve all the problems? Anyway, so the Radak explains that the drashos of Chanina ben Chizkiah were different than the drashos of the Gemara, and we lost them. We don't have his drashos anymore. Because if we had them, we wouldn't have needed Rabbi Yochanan's explanation and Ravina Rav Ashi's explanation. Okay, so now we're continuing on with the next line of the Mishnah. Tana Rabbanan, the Mishnah said, I'm Rabbi Shimon, if you had enough money to buy a lot of bowls, but then you wouldn't have any of the nisachim, the flour and the wine, then bring the bowl with the nisachim and not a lot of bowls. And this, from the fact that this is recording the name of Rabbi Shimon, it seems that the Rabbanan obviously argue with him. Tana Rabbanan, it says in Yechezkel, the Ephah Lapar, the Ephah La'ayel, and you bring with the bowl an ephah of flour and an ephah with ram. Yasem mincha, ulkvasim kasher tasig yado, and for the sheep, whatever you can find, v'shemen hin la'ephah, and for each ephah you bring a hin of oil. So Amar Rabbi Shimon, wait 1 second, they're not the same. We know that the nesachim are listed in the Torah, and the nesachim are different. For a bowl, you need 3, and for an aisle 2. Isaron. So the chimidas param ve'elam achas, are they the same? They're not the same. The bull and the ram have very different measurements. So why is Ezekiel saying that they're the same? Ela shema hayula and param merubin. It means if you had a lot of bulls, v'lo hayu nisachim, and they don't have anything for the nisachim, yaviu parachad unisachim. Bring one bull and its nisachim. V'al yakrivu kulan bull nisachim. But Ezekiel is saying, don't bring all of them without the nesachim. V'im hayu lahem elim merubin v'lo yolam efasan. And if you had a lot of rams on the top of memheyim abeis without their flour, yaviu ayal chad ve'efasa v'lo yakrivu kulan below efus. Don't bring all of them without any flour. Okay, now on to the next Mishnah. Apar va'elim v'akvasim v'aseir ema akven esalachem. We're now talking about the 2 loaves of bread that are waved on Shavuos, and those are 2 loaves made out of wheat. They allow the wheat offering in the temple. So Gemara says that accompanying those 2 loaves of bread are 7 sheep and a bull and 2 rams. And then you have to bring also 1 goat for a chatas and 2 sheep for a shlamim. So the Gemara says, so you bring an olah, again, 7 sheep, 1 bull, and 2 rams as an olah. You bring a goat as a chatas, and 2 sheep for a shlamim. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, Hapar va'elim v'akvasim, this bull, these 2 rams, these 7 sheep, v'asayir, and the goat, the sin offering, ein ma'akvin esalachem. They don't prevent the 2 loaves of bread from being waved. Meaning to say you wave the loaves. You don't bring them on the offering, on the altar. So if you don't have them, you can still wave the loaves. And the bread does not prevent them. the bread is ma'akev the sheep. This is referring presumably to the two sheep of the shlamim, but the kvasim of the shlamim of the shtei do not prevent the bread. This is the position of Rabbi Akiva. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas. Lo ki kvasim ma'akvenes alachem. He said. So Rabbi Akiva says the bread prevents the sheep from being brought, but the sheep do not prevent the bread. Whereas Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas says no. The sheep is what prevents the bread. But the bread does not prevent the sheep. When the Jewish people were in the wilderness for 40 years, they brought the sheep even though there was no bread. Also, why did they bring the sheep without the bread in the wilderness? There are two explanations. One Rashi says here, one elsewhere. Elsewhere he says because they didn't have bread, they only have none. Here Rashi says because the bread, the shtei lechem was supposed to come from the crops of the land, and since they weren't in Israel yet, they didn't bring the shtei lechem, but they still brought the sheep even without the bread. So it says that's why Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas. So Amar Rabbi Shimon, halacha kedivrei ben Nanas. Rabbi Shimon says the law is like ben Nanas. So back to the text of the Mishnah. Aval ena tam kidvarav. The law is like him, but it's not for his reasoning. Shekoa omer chumash pekudim karav b'midbar, because everything that is said in b'midbar was brought in the wilderness. Cholak, meaning the in Pinchas, the karbanos musaf. The whole amar b'toras kohanim, but whatever is said in Amor, in Vayikra, ein karav b'midbar, was not brought. They brought the karbanos musaf, but they didn't bring the karbanos of the chagim that were listed in Amor. And when they came to the land of Israel, then they brought both Pinchas and Emor. So why, says Rabbi Shimon, do I agree with Ben Nanas that you could bring the sheep without the bread, but you can't bring the bread without the sheep? The sheep becomes permitted when they're slaughtered, so therefore they have a matir, they have an allowance. Whereas the bread, there's nothing to allow it, meaning to say they're not slaughtered and there's no blood sprinkled on it. So therefore, the sheep were not allowed, the bread were not allowed without the sheep. So it says about the offering of on Shavuos, the 2 loaves of bread are waved, and you shall bring on these bread. So that teaches us chova al halachem. It teaches us that when you have to bring these 7 sheep, it implies that they're both required. That's the implication. Vikraftem al halachem, that you need the sheep in order to bring the bread, and the bread in order to bring the sheep. Shivas kvasim tamimim. But then it says 7. But then it says in the pasuk, Shivas kvasim tamimim, 7 pure sheep, which implies afal pishein lachem. That implies even though there is no bread. So what do we do? Why do we do for the fact that the verse says on the bread? Rabbi Tarfon teaches us that as long as they were in the wilderness and they weren't obligated to bring the bread offering, therefore they were not obligated to bring this sheep offering. Rabbi Shimon and Ben Nanas, that as long as they were in the wilderness, they didn't bring the karbanos of Vayikra. Rabbi Akiva Omer Yachol Hein Kivasam Amurim Khan Hein Kivasam Amurim B'chumash Pekudim. How do I know that the 7 sheep that are mentioned in Vayikra as an oil offering are not the same 7 sheep that are mentioned in Pinchas with the Musaf. Amris Kishatamagia Eitzel Param Ve'elim Ein on Ein. You see that when you come to the number of bulls and rams, they're not the same. That they don't jive. That because in Parshas Pinchas it says for the Musaf to bring 2 bulls and 1 ram, and here it says 1 bull and 2 rams. Ela halalu ba'in beglal atzman, v'halalu ba'in beglal echem. So the korbanos in Pinchas they come on their own, whereas the korbanos in Vayikra and Emor, they come only if the bread is brought. Nimtza mash amar b'chumash hapikudim kar b'midbar. So therefore, that which was mentioned in Parashas Pinchas, the Musafs, they were brought in the wilderness. Umasha amar b'toras kohanim, and that which is mentioned specifically to the festival in Emor about the 2 loaves, that was not brought in the wilderness. The Gemara says, but why does Rabbi Akiva have to reach that conclusion? V'dilma param ve'elim lav inu. Maybe. So the Gemara says, but maybe the bulls and the rams from Pinchas and Vayikra, they're not the same. But hakavasim inu. But maybe the sheep that's mentioned in both places is the same. Gemara says, no, we don't want to say that. Midahani ishti. From the fact that the bulls and the rams are changed, ani nami da'achrini. We assume that the sheep is not talking about the same type of sheep offering that's mentioned in Pinchas. Uparim ve'elam mimai de'ishtinu. How do we know that the bulls and the rams are different? Maybe the Torah is telling us, if you want to bring 1 bull and 2 rams, as it's mentioned in Emor, you could do that. And if you want to bring 2 bulls and 1 ram, as it's mentioned in Pinchas, that you could do. So maybe that's all it's saying. So the Gemara says we don't want to give that conclusion because the Gemara says mida ishtini sidran shma mina achrini, for the fact that they're mentioned in a different order, meaning to say that in Emor it says the sheep first, and then it says 1 bull and then 2 rams, and in Pinchas it says the 1 bull, then the 2 bulls, the 1 ram, and then the 7 sheep. So from the fact that the order was changed, we see it's different. Gemara says the bread prevents the sheep from being brought. That's the position of Rabbi Akiva. My time of Rabbi Akiva. So what's the basic reason for Rabbi Akiva? Gemara answers, Gamar yiyu mitiena. He learns it out from the word yiyu that said at the beginning of the 2 loaves of bread, from the word tiena that said earlier in that pasuk. Malalan lechem, afkan lechem. Just like it said about the 2 loaves of bread that they're waved, shnei esronim, so estiena. So too here also with respect to the sheep, it means that you can't bring them without the bread. Benanas, who says that you can't bring the bread without the sheep, Gamar yiyu, he learns out from the 7 sheep that are brought with the 2 loaves of bread. There it says yiyu, and it learns it out to the yiyu that's mentioned by the 2 loaves. Even though the 2 loaves, it doesn't say you, it says tiena. Malalan kvasin, avkan kvasin. Just like with respect to the olah, it says you require sheep. So too with respect to the 2 loaves of bread, it's you need the sheep. Bananas nami nelach mitiena. So the Gemara says, well, that why doesn't he learn it out from tiena? That's written at the beginning of the parasha to say that the sheep is required from the bread. So he says, so he says, no, because it's not the same word. Dana yumi you, dana yumi tiena. You learned that you from you and not you from tiena. The Gemara says, but we already learned that they don't have to be exact. It doesn't have to be the exact word to make a zera shav. Gemara says, that's where if there's no exact match. But if there's an exact match, we learn out from the ones that are direct match. Rabbi Kiva nami ne'ach miyu. So why doesn't Rabbi Kiva learn out from the 7 sheep of the olah, like bananas, that the bread is that the without the sheep you can't bring the bread? because done and davar shematanu hakohen midavar shematanu hakohen. Because Rabbi Akiva says we're going to learn that which is a gift to the Kohen by the 2 loaves of bread from the word tiena, which is said from the 2 loaves that are given to the Kohen. Lafuke hani the oasinu. He doesn't want to learn that from the sheep because that's an oah, and those are not given to the Kohen. Vibayis ema for achila anyway. Vibayis ema bekra gufe kamiflir. Alternatively, Rabbi Akiva and Menachos are arguing in the pasuk itself. It says in the pasuk, kodesh yu Hashem lakohen, that the 2 loaves of bread are going to be kodesh for Hashem for the Kohen. Kodesh yu Hashem lakohen. The Kohen shall wave the bread of the Bikurim al shnei kvasim kodesh yu Hashem lakohen. Ve'ezu davar shakul the Kohen. What's something that entirely goes to the Kohen? That's the 2 loaves of bread. Avil mer zeh lechem. So therefore, we're going to see that the word "yu" applies to 2 loaves of bread, and we see that that's the ones that are essential. Whereas benanas miksiv kodesh yu lakohen. It says kodesh yu Hashem lakohen. It says kodesh for Hashem for the Kohen. What's something that's partially for Hashem, partially for the Kohen? And that's the sheep. So the sheep is what's essential. Rabbi Akiva miksiv kodesh yu Hashem v'la Kohen. It doesn't say kodesh yu Hashem and for the Kohen. It says La Hashem, La Kohen. It doesn't say for Hashem and the Kohen. And Kirafuna, Damrafuna, Kano Hashem. Hashem fully acquires it. Unisano a Kohen. Hashem's not splitting with the Kohen. He's giving it completely to the Kohanim. Okay, that's today's daf. We'll stop here. Went a little extra. Sorry about that.